Okay, so now we're at the point we need to come up with cockpit rails. This is an 8-foot piece, 8-foot long piece of plywood that I inherited from my father when he moved out of my parents' last house. And they sold it, so I got all their leftover stuff, including just random scraps of plywood. Any plywood would work. I know I've also showed in, or I mentioned in the instructable, things like these. These are what they sell for 5-gallon paint buckets for stirring. You could glue a whole bunch of these to the inside of your rail. It's just that every break, you then need another piece of wood to go over that gap, about 2 inches on either side, and glue that on. You end up with little lumps in the rail. You can do it that way. You can, I mean, they sell wooden yardsticks at the hardware store. You could use those. They're 3 feet, about 1 meter long. If you live in the rest of the world, they probably sell wooden meter sticks. They're cheap. If you don't want to buy a whole sheet of plywood, can't get a hold of a sheet of plywood, you could go over to the moulding aisle in the hardware store and buy a piece of moulding, 1/4 inch thick. I don't know how many millimeters that works out to. And about 2 inches wide is what I like to work with. This is a little bit narrower than I would work with, but it works. That's a good size. You just need a piece of wood that runs continuously along the top edge of the cockpit. So in this case, I have this scrap. As I said, when my parents sold their house, they got rid of a lot of stuff because they moved into a condo, and so I inherited a lot of stuff, and if it was useful, I took it with me. So every 2 inches on this piece of wood, I'm going to go ahead and mark, and I can get a number of 8-foot long by 2-inch strips out of this, which is good. And then I got to do the same thing to the other end. And with both ends marked, take the chalk line, line it over the mark on one end, which if you zoom in, you can see the mark in the window inside that little metal clip that is perfectly designed to clip onto ends of plywood and boards. That tells us we're lined up with that, and then just simply pull the chalk line a whole way. Don't do it that way. That was not the right way. Pull it all the way down. Line it up on the mark on the other end. And you have your cut line for your first strip marked. Then you're just simply going to cut along each of those lines with the skill saw. Now, I build boats continuously and repair them and modify them all the time. So I'm going to cut them all out because it's the best use for my plywood. Maybe in your case you only need enough to make one boat, so only cut enough for what you need and save the rest for another project. Just demonstrating the difference in the width between what I like to use, a 2-inch strip of plywood, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy for plywood. It's kind of funny, my dad had this stuff sitting around for years, and this is kind of junk plywood. As you can see, it's one thin layer there, kind of a filler layer, and another thin layer. It doesn't have to be marine, doesn't have to be good quality. I usually use a little bit better quality than this that actually has 5 plies to it, but this 3-ply will work. Because remember, this is the top rail of the boat, and the top rail of the boat is the furthest up away from the water. So this will never really get wet once it's all wrapped with your poor man's fiberglass and painted well. Just demonstrating the difference. You know, you're losing It's about 3/8 of an inch. Don't know what that works out to in the rest of the world. And it won't hurt anything. If you bought molding, I know they make like lattice type stuff for like doing screens on porches that is very similar to this. That would work. Solid wood might stand up a little better than plywood getting wet, but these really don't get wet. I've never had one fail in all the boats I build, and I store them outside. They're in the snow, they're in the rain. They sit outside on top of my firewood piles year round. And it's kind of funny, my dad, I don't know where this probably would come from. It may have actually come from a crate that something got shipped in where I worked once or where he worked. But he had an idea to make these. He actually drew a plan out. He was going to use stitch and glue, marine epoxy, and fiberglass to stick it all together. He got as far as cutting it out in cardstock, and it hung on his office wall for years, and that's as far as it got. So it's kind of funny that this is now going into a boat that I'm building. Well, my dad had it intended for a boat as well. He never would have imagined the foam boat that I actually created because I wanted to build a kayak that he could use when he was in his 60s and having trouble lifting things. And he was able to use his foam kayak for a few years, so that was a great thing. So then, next thing, how to put these in the boat. I was telling you, this is how I normally store my Sawfish kayaks. They sit out here on top of my firewood racks year round, in the snow, in the sun, rain, ice, basically impervious. It's one of the great things about them. But what I really wanted to show you here, now that I got them outside and down on the ground, just an interesting rail treatment that I did for these. These originally started out as two 8-foot long Sawfish made for my kids. If you look on my Facebook, Rower Wet Facebook page, or hunt around in my YouTube channels, you'll find videos of my kids and even me paddling these when they were 8 feet long. Well, obviously kids grow up, and a tandem made a lot more sense, so I simply took them, and you can find the album where I did it. I chopped them right in half, and basically ended up with about that much of the boat, and I don't know, maybe that much of the boat, I'm not even sure exactly now. And I spliced in 8 feet in the middle, or 6 feet, I guess 6 feet, 6 and 8, yeah. So 6 feet right there in the cockpit on both of them, and I made two 14-foot tandems, and my kids paddle them one in each, two in each boat, and my wife and I have also paddled the orange one here. That's Dusty, and this one is blue one is Mermaid. And just showing you the rail treatment, and also one of the reasons I do the rails, I have different ideas for seats, and I'll get to this later on, but you'll notice I made these little loops, and I'll show you more about them. But that is so you can use those high back kayak seats for sit on top kayaks, or different styles sit in as well, and you can clip the clips onto those and adjust the straps and have one style of seating. A little bit more expensive. I've found other things that are more easy. These take a little bit to set up, and you have to think about what you're doing, but it's an option, and that's what I'm showing you here. Just showing you different rail treatments that I have done. I like those rounded fronts, but you'll notice I'm not copying it on my later ones. It has its pluses and minuses. Aesthetically, it's really nice. This is Sunfish, or Sunburn, sorry. Sunburn is the boat that my son built for himself when he was 12 years old. We figure it's the only one I've ever tracked the time on. Took 21 hours roughly, start to finish, and he loved it because at age 12, I was shocked. He picked it up and carried it around to the car all by himself because 25 pounds. It was no big deal. I expected I'd have to carry it for him. And as you see here, that lighter spot with the pink, that's where, for a 12-year-old, we set the aft part of the cockpit. He's grown a little. He's 16 now, and so it tells you the age of the boat. And it needed some more room. He was starting to have to paddle with his knees bent, feeling a little cramped. So we lengthened the cockpit, and part of the reason I'm showing you this is it shows, you know, the extension I made, and then right here, there's a little block to bridge between the two rails, because if you leave a split in the rail, on the water it won't hurt anything. However, tied down to the vehicle and sitting on like my firewood racks or whatever, it will start to split the foam, and it'll tear the fabric and start to split the foam, and it won't hurt anything. It just looks ugly. But if you put that little splice in there, that won't happen. And just showing you, you know, rail treatment. There it is, 2-inch, another block on this side. Just, and this right here is the weight I recommend for all the kayaks I build now. Give yourself as much cockpit as possible. You can carry a child, large, small dogs, cargo. It's much more useful to have this large open cockpit. You could even fit two smaller people in a pinch, if, you know, for whatever reason, if you somebody like me that goes on camping trips and does interesting adventures, and sometimes people in boats get separated or whatever, and this is a way you can pick somebody up and carry them along without it being awkward or unsafe or having to leave them behind and come back and get them. It works. And so different rail treatments, you know, curved or straight like this, either way. Like I said, I like the curved ends. They could be less useful in some certain situations, but they look nice. But just showing you what I mean by the splices, because we're going to have to splice the cockpit rails on this boat, because the cockpit is like 9.5 feet long, I believe. And these 8-foot strips obviously aren't going to be long enough. So just showing you why and how the splices work. This is just kind of thrown in there for the fun of it, but there was a divot right here in this rail. So the other day as I was working on other stuff, I decided, you know what? I created this little scrap of foam. I'm going to glue it onto the hull and fill that in so I don't have a divot anymore. And I just simply taped it. Now I'm going to have to smooth that down because obviously it sticks out. But that's better because now I can hit it with the power plane, smooth it right down, and I will have this little divot area filled in and no longer looking ugly. So as I mentioned, since we're laying out our cockpit here, you know, we got 8 footers, and if we throw, oh, came up short, look at that. It's about 1.5 feet. I guess I was right. This is a 9.5 foot cockpit roughly. So I'm going to need some strips only that long to make up the rail. Now these rails are, believe it or not, they are structural. I originally thought I was just adding them so that when you have it strapped down to a car with, you know, your cross rack right here, and you throw a strap over the boat and cinch it down, you know, I thought, well, that's just so it doesn't dent into the foam. That's why I originally added them. What I've discovered since then is if you don't put them in, the boat's all floppy and twisty, and this is really actually, as weird as it could seem, if you know anything about boat building, usually there'll be a keel that's laid down, and then there'll be frames, you know, going across, tied to the keel. If you're talking a ship or a sailboat, something large, even motorboats, anything made out of wood usually has a frame like that. Well, as weird as it may seem, these built into the cockpit walls are more or less the keel, the backbone. You think of like a backbone in a human body with ribs coming off of it, just like in your back. This is the backbone of the boat, is the way to think of it. As weird as it is, and in the odd place that it's located, it's actually necessary for structure. So as you can tell, we've got this gap at the front. Now I've got my 8-footers cut here, but 8-footers I'd rather keep whole rather than chopping them up. So I'm going to save this, and I have, as you can tell, this is a rough, ugly strip that has been used before at some other point and has been removed. It shows you how well the Gorilla Glue and just the swirly pattern that I usually use for gluing actually stuck to the foam. This is how strong it is adhered. Now what I'll do, since I don't want this stuff getting in the way, is I'm going to glue it this way. Glue this face to the foam. So I need to find out how much I need here. Now I'm going to show you, I want to go a couple inches beyond this because I actually cut pockets into the bow and the stern decks so that the wood actually goes in like that to give it a more solid, everything being stuck together. It's pocketed into the foam and fully glued. So with that understood, I'm going to cut this, because I'm going to do the same with that, and that's butted against the stern rail, right, the stern deck right now. That same thing can be pocketed in there. So I'm going to go over almost 2 inches. And that mark right there, I'm going to cut at, and now this will be my forward part, and then I'm going to have to sand this so I can actually glue on a joint piece between the two of them. You know, if you want to get fancy, you could look up how to do a scarf joint or a butt joint with fiberglass and epoxy. And you could make a rail that's all one piece, or you could just go to the lumber area, your hardware store, and buy moulding that's 12 feet long, quite often 16 feet. They come in different lengths, besides 8 foot. You can do it that way. This is just how I'm doing it. I'm showing you a variety of ways. As I said, you can piece it together with your stirring sticks. You know, you're gonna have to do a bunch. Yardsticks, meter sticks, whatever they are in your country. Could also work, but you're gonna have to figure the number of them, and then you're gonna have to figure, you know, cutting off sections, bridge the gaps. Whatever's cheaper, whatever you have the ability to handle. Obviously, bringing home a stack of meter sticks, if you're somebody who only rides a bicycle or rides the bus or the train, would be a lot easier than trying to carry a 4x8 sheet of plywood or whatever they call it. You know, if you don't have a car, or you have a small car, don't know how to transport it, all different things you can do. I'm just showing you the way I like to do it, and as long as you have wood in your rails, that's the important thing, because as I said, this is really the function of the keel of the boat, and it's just in an odd place.